Horror, a painful and intense fear, dread, or dismay, the quality of inspiring horror, repulsive, horrible, or dismal quality or character. Horrors, a state of extreme depression or apprehension. Film, a motion picture or movie. In both the past and modern day, our world has been filled with horrors. Creative arts has always been around to process the world around us, whether it is through paintings, music, literature, or even film. Art has always been an outlet to channel the experiences of our human condition. In the late 19th century, a new invention called film helped usher in a new era of storytelling. A series of moving pictures gave birth to the motion picture and the film industry. One genre has been there since the beginning, way before the blockbusters. The genre of horror had its place early on in film, just like literature, with Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, Bram Stoker's Dracula, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Horror had its place in film since the beginning. The first horror film was known as The House of the Devil in 1896, a short 2.5-minute film that is credited as being the first ever horror film. The start of the 20th century ushered in a new era, and with the invention of cinema, more supernatural-themed films were made in the horror genre. An early adaptation of Frankenstein was released by Edison Studios, in addition to film adaptations of The Werewolf and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Those films, along with so many early horror films, are now lost through the annals of time. But there is one lost horror film that helped usher in the golden age of horror. An early adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula called Nosferatu in 1922, starring Max Schreck as Count Orlok. A silent film which of course had different character names, but was a frightening adaptation of Bram Stoker's original novel. Many copies of the film were destroyed, but one survived. There is also The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, released in 1920. These horror films in the silent era helped make way for the era of the talkies. In essence, the era of sound. An era where we would learn to listen to the Children of the Night and the music they make. Okay. For old school horror fans or cinephiles, you know the significance of the Universal horror pictures, the classic monsters. Some of you may even remember the late 90s in which these films were re-released on VHS. Some of you may know about the Blu-ray and 4K Blu-ray sets, maybe even seen these films on Turner Classic Movies. It is in this era that the term horror is born to describe the genre. The 1930s and 40s brought us an array of monsters with Frankenstein, the Mummy, Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein, Creature of the Black Lagoon, and The Wolfman, along with so much more. These films created horror stars for Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and Lon Chaney Jr. This is the golden era that made horror different from any other genre. These films were made during a depression and the rise of new technology. As I stated earlier, art imitates life and is a reflection of our world. A Second World War and the aftermath of it would soon change the world, and horror in film would reflect that change. In the aftermath of World War II, the classic horror icons took a back seat and became punchlines in comedic films such as Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. There were a series of Abbott and Costello films that were released in the late 40s to mid-50s. American audiences were yearning for something else and no longer wanted to be scared. The genre of horror, as it was known, remained dormant for a short period of time. But into the 50s and mid-60s entered a new threat. A fear of another war loomed over society. America dropped the atomic bomb and now had to deal with the repercussions of that invention and the fear of a future apocalypse. Horror began to reflect this new war. The Cold War influenced horror by taking away these supernatural monsters and presenting us with a more grounded monster, more human than ever before with mad scientists. Not only human scientists, but their mutated creations. There was a plethora of monster flicks, ranging from giant insects to creatures beneath the sea. But there was one monster that was a result of the atomic bomb. A Japanese film that made its debut to the United States in 1956. A film called Gojira, aka Godzilla, King of the Monsters. But monsters did not come from just the earth, but from above the sky. Soon after the Roswell incident, horror and sci-fi movies began to show us aliens, with films like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, The War of the Worlds, The Thing from Another World, The Blob, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Most often, these films would show us misunderstood aliens or violent aliens that wanted to eradicate the human race. These sci-fi horror films were different than what came before. But going back to a human threat, these films also reflected not only the mistrust of the government, but the mistrust to our own neighbors. Is someone I know really who they say they are? In this period, we had McCarthyism, also known as the Second Red Scare, a campaign against alleged communists in the US carried out under Senator Joseph McCarthy. What better film to showcase this paranoia than the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a film where aliens inhabit the body of people. Your next door neighbor or loved one could really be an alien. Is anyone who they say they are? These films even continue to the early 60s with Village of the Damned. However, there is still room for the original monsters of horror. In Britain, there is finally a lift on the horror ban, which made room for what many horror aficionados know as the Hammer film era. Hammer Films was founded in 1934, and they made different films before moving to the horror genre, which included crime thrillers. When moving to horror, they decided to adapt the classic monsters and give them an update by bringing the creature features in color. The Curse of Frankenstein was their first horror film, known for the blood, set design, costuming, and color. Soon after, a new era was born with the releases of The Mummy, Horror of Dracula, The Abominable Snowman, The Revenge of Frankenstein, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, and so much more. Doubling down on grounded threats, there is a birth of one type of prominent horror film we see today. The dawn of the 1960s gave way to the start of the slasher genre with Peeping Tom, a sympathetic character that could be like anyone you and I know, but one with a level of malevolence beneath the surface. In the same year, a classic from Alfred Hitchcock was also released called Psycho, showing the character of Norman Bates, who on the surface seems like a nice person. Under the surface, proves to be a damaged individual. It's fair to say that there would be no Halloween or Scream without Psycho. I mean, just look at the Loomis connection. In addition to the human threat, horror films began to show forces of nature that were beyond our control. Alfred Hitchcock followed up Psycho with The Birds. Also beyond control is rapid change and uncertainty going into the 60s. The stability created after World War II began to crumble as attitudes rapidly shifted, and a generation gap grew more. The 60s horror films began to focus on humanity itself, not just aliens or nuclear monsters. Filmmakers felt more freedom as violence and sex were depicted in a different way. Up-and-coming filmmakers actually had something to say with the genre. Most notable is a film called Night of the Living Dead, directed by George A. Romero. A zombie film at first glance, but really it's a social commentary about the racial tension in the country. Whether it is the martial law depicted in the opening of the film that mirrored riots at the time, or the shocking end with the main character, an African-American man, getting gunned down by a police officer. The main hero of the story, who is not a zombie, who not only survived the night, but helped others, brutally gunned down to death. This would not be the first time that Romero provided social commentary to audiences. His follow-up in 1978, Dawn of the Dead, was a commentary on consumerism. The film was set inside a shopping mall, and the zombies represented the addiction to consume. The 60s on to 70s also provided chillers in the midst of thrillers. New icons like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, and Christopher Lee took the stage in monster films. Chillers and religious horror films like The Haunting, Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, The Exorcist, The Wicker Man, no, not that one, and Carrie take the screen. But then there is a new wave of horror that harkens back to the days of slasher films and horror icons. The 70s offered films like Jaws, Black Christmas, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Halloween. It was evident that these films became more excessive, reflecting the real horrors of the 60s and 70s with assassinations, the Vietnam War, and civil rights. The world was at times becoming a darker place, Even though there wasn't the threat of nuclear Armageddon or little green men falling from the skies, society had to take a look at itself, and the horror genre began to reflect that darkness, as well as providing another kind of darkness to escape from reality. The late 70s and 80s was not only a golden renaissance for the slasher genre, but for horror films itself. Filmmakers that grew up in previous decades now were making their own films. The 80s was like a melting pot of everything that came before, but with something new. Halloween paved the way for Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. With Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, Jason, and Leatherface, you now had horror figures that were just as iconic as the classic Universal monsters in their heyday. Remakes of The Fly and The Thing offered brand new visions to a classic story. Original horrors such as The Howling, Poltergeist, The Shining, Videodrome, Sleepaway Camp, An American Werewolf in London, Alien, Aliens, Scanners, Reanimator, The Evil Dead 2, Children of the Corn, Fright Night, The Lost Boys, Near Dark, Child's Play, Phantasm, Hellraiser, and so much more was introduced. If one film was never enough, there was then a sequel upon sequel made, creating horror franchises. After the 80s, audiences and the industry suffered horror fatigue. It was the same old, with nothing new, but just films after films being made. Horror films watered down more and more after each entry. Horror films that tried to up the ante but already had gone long past their welcome. I describe the 90s as pre-Scream and post-Scream. Even though there wasn't as much horror as we knew it from the 80s, there was horror elements now in other genres. The horror in film became more sophisticated, having its influence in works such as Manhunter, Silence of the Lambs, Seven, Jacob's Ladder, Misery, Fallen, Arachnophobia, The People Under the Stairs, Tremors, and Interview with the Vampire. But you still had Child's Play sequels, Leprechaun, Candyman, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare. New Nightmare is interesting because it is a meta-horror film that was made before Scream, and by the same director, Wes Craven. A film that bombed at the box office due to Pulp Fiction being released at the same time. It is a film that has received cult status, which brings us to Scream. A wonderful film directed by Wes Craven and written by Kevin Williamson that happens to not only reinvent the slasher horror genre, but actually be self-aware. Scream started a new trend of meta-horror, which provided us characters that grew up with the horror genre, knowing all the rules, but still falling victim to the game they are in. The 90s brought a Gulf War, and despite certain events, it was a decade that was far calmer than previous ones. No longer did we have the fear of the Cold War, and horror began to feel like fiction with monsters not being real. But Scream presented a modern horror fable, a fiction becoming reality. Other films like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Idle Hands, Halloween H20, Sleepy Hollow, The Sixth Sense, John Carpenter's Vampires, From Dusk Till Dawn, The Faculty, Mimic, Bride of Chucky, Cherry Falls, End of Days, Disturbing Behavior, The Craft, and Final Destination carved their way into the horror genre. At the end of the decade and 20th century, there was another birth in the horror genre. A project, more specifically, the Blair Witch Project, gave way to the found footage genre. I would argue that without Blair Witch, no, not Book of Shadows, I would argue that there wouldn't be a Paranormal Activity or VHS without it. A film that was fiction looked real through the use of a camcorder, a group of people in the woods. It brings horror back to the cabin in the woods trope, but makes it feel real and grounded, because we as the audience are not only watching this unfold in real time, but filming and experiencing horror in real time. A feeling that is all more relevant now with social media and iPhones. The Blair Witch Project brought horror into the modern 21st century. With the rise of new technology, the film industry is introduced to digital cameras. The real feeling of Blair Witch was magnified in Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, along with the remake of Dawn of the Dead by Zack Snyder, Resident Evil, and Shaun of the Dead. The zombie film was resurrecting, proving to be undead rather than dead in the horror genre. The 2000s also brought in more remakes, sequels, and revivals. Freddy vs. Jason, 13 Ghosts, My Bloody Valentine 3D, the Final Destination franchise, a reimagining of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Halloween by Rob Zombie. Genres began to blend, with Underworld, Blade 2, Hellboy, and Constantine. Influences from Asian cinema began to show in American film with The Grudge and The Ring. In addition to remakes, you also had different horror films, both studio and indie, with Ginger Snaps, Dog Soldiers, Mirrors, Jennifer's Body, The Strangers, The Collector, The Uninvited, Silent Hill, Wreck, Trick or Treat, Orphan, John Carpenter's Ghost of Mars, When a Stranger Calls, The Mist, Drag Me to Hell, The Ninth Gate, Jeepers Creepers, The Devil's Rejects, The Others, Stay Alive, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Most notable from this decade would be the rise of torture porn or brutal thrillers with Saw and Hostel. In a post-9/11, post-terror world, you can see how world events began to shift the horror genre throughout the 2000s. How biological threats, long before COVID-19, began to influence horror. How the acceleration of technology began to shape the world we live in, and how film reflected it. The 2010s offered us the usual with horror films. There will always be sequels or remakes that feel derivative compared to the original. Going into the decade, there is definitely a shift in quality within the horror genre. Now, will the genre of horror win an Oscar? Very rarely, if never at all. For some reason, horror is still taboo, which is sad and just plain wrong. But I'll tell you why I love horror. It's not for the kills, the sex, the jokes, the scares, the jump scares. No. It is because horror films say something and are able to say things about society and the human condition that other genres are not able to. You take a look at A Nightmare on Elm Street, a film that shows a generation gap between parents and children, but also a film that shows parents unwilling to listen to their children, even when they are right or in danger. Always blaming and having preconceptions. Now, it's not like you can't have that type of story in a drama, but as a horror film, it's able to get a message across in a different way. The Purge Anarchy is a film where all crime is legal for 12 hours. On the surface, it seems like a nihilistic dystopian thriller, which in many ways it is, but it is also a film about social class and how those in the 1% upper class would like to get rid of the lower class. You won't see that in the Best Picture at the Oscars. The 2010s had films like Insidious, Sinister, The Conjuring, The Purge, Devil, Scream 4, Black Swan, Get Out, Us, Ready or Not, Hereditary, Midsommar, The Babadook, Crawl, Happy Death Day, Bone Tomahawk, Don't Breathe, Green Room, Raw, Train to Busan, The Black Coat's Daughter, and so much more. The film Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele, in many ways is like The Skeleton Key and The Stepford Wives before it. But it is also a film about racism. No, not your traditional racism. It isn't going American History X. It shows us a family of white liberals. A character that says, I would have voted for Obama a third time. Get Out is a film that shows us people who aren't racist as long as they remain in power. And the disguise the film has, is slavery. It presents the audience with systemic racism. Jordan Peele brought us a new thriller, with some of its twists apparent and others requiring a second viewing to truly grasp the intricacy of the film. Again, with the themes of identity, his follow-up film, Us, is about a family being confronted by their own doppelgangers, a film about the theme of duality in human nature. In conclusion, horror may not get the acclaim it deserves from the film industry, but that does not mean horror films are not appreciated. It doesn't mean that horror films are not relevant, because if you ask me, horror films are relevant now more than they ever were before. Whether it is in the good or bad times, times of peace or times of war, times of unity or times of division, the horror genre will always be around and always be forever changing. For the world we live in forever changes with each passing minute. The horror genre, like other art forms, will always be an outlet, a way to reflect and process the outside world around all of us. Just like paintings, music, literature, or even film, art has always been an outlet to channel the experiences of our human condition. That is why horror will always remain relevant. Happy Halloween, everyone.